Great to be joined now by Derek Grossman, who's with the Rand Corporation, been following this very closely, writing extensively about it as well. Derek, thank you so much for joining us. How do you see this moving forward now? Are we heading for some sort of a resolution, or do you think things are going to get a lot worse before they start to settle down?
Yeah, so I think a lot is still to be determined, right? We're only about a week into this diplomatic row, as you mentioned, and so we may see a number of twists and turns to come, but I think the main issue right now is what kind of evidence does Canada have as part of its investigation into the allegation that India committed an extrajudicial killing on its territory. And it is unclear whether Canada is able or willing to allow that information to become public. I think the more likely scenario is that Canada will share whatever it has behind the scenes with Indian intelligence and with Indian officials, and there will be, and this is my hope as well, that there will be kind of a quiet negotiation bilaterally between the two in order to resolve the differences that we've seen explode onto the scene in the last week.
Derek, you're right. It would mean one thing if all of that had happened before the charges had actually been made public. But now that we are where we are, and Canada can keep saying you need to cooperate in the investigation, and I guess that's what America is saying as well. But I think from an Indian point of view, there is a very legitimate expectation right now that at some point Canada and other countries have to start taking the entire question of violence and terrorism and the incitement of violence inside India and the incitement of violence inside Punjab by these Khalistani militants and extremists. It has to be taken seriously. Because as you well know, this has no echo, this has no resonance inside India itself. Punjab is peaceful. And here are people trying to whip up trouble in what is right now a peaceful state. And that's why there is that expectation that at some point, Canada has got to turn its attention towards dealing with the extremism.
Yeah. So I think that as part of the negotiations, there will have to be a discussion about, how from the Indian side to Canada, how will Canada handle this in the future, and will it kind of meet the standards of what India is looking for based upon the as from New Delhi's perspective, this threat of terrorism and secessionism that some Sikhs within Canada and elsewhere, and perhaps within India, what they seek to achieve with an independent Khalistan, right? And so that is something that I think will have to be part of the negotiations. But I also think that Canada will stress that as a democrat, as a fellow democratic country that respects its citizens' civil liberties and their freedom of speech and their privacy, that there's only so much Canada will be willing and able to do in that circumstance.
All right, Drake, I'm going to turn to something else that you've been tweeting about and a lot of people have been talking about. Do India and the West have the same values? Is there a question of shared values? And there are some people, including yourself and others, who've been sometimes questioning whether there is really that sense of shared values or not. And I guess when you talk about that in questions like democratic backsliding and others, sometimes there are people in India who would agree with some of those concerns. On this particular issue, there's been a lot of unanimity. And I think one of the reasons why there has been that unanimity is because surely shared values also have to reflect shared concerns about each other's problems. You can't say, my terrorist is a big problem, your terrorist is fine. I guess what a lot of people in India are actually questioning and asking is, what happens if you keep on expressing concerns, as have been expressed to the Canadians for 40 years? These are people whipping up terrorism, these are people whipping up violence. And if you don't take those concerns on board, not for 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, if you don't take those concerns on board, what should you do? What would the United States do? What would other countries in the West do? What would Canada do? What should you do if somebody does not pay heed to your concerns, even if you share values?
Yeah, I think, there's a number of issues here. But I'll just say that the US is in a pretty tough spot because, yes, there, of course, have been times in which the US has felt that countries have harbored terrorists and have not done enough to address their terrorist threat, and the U.S. has taken unilateral action, whether it's through drone strikes or other means, right? And so I'm hearing a lot from Indians these days about how it is, contradictory, right, for the U.S. to say, it's hypocritical, right, for the U.S. to say that, India, let's say for a second that India actually did do this in Canada, right? Well, it's hypocritical to say that the Indians should not have been allowed to do this when the U.S. has done this type of thing in the past, right? And when you bring up the shared values point, the Biden administration and the Modi government has repeatedly talked about how both sides have shared values on democracy, right? But I think there have also been brewing concerns within the United States and perhaps in other Western countries as well that Modi's government is increasingly an illiberal government and that it is not necessarily a government that shares the same values as the United States and the broader West. And I know that this irks India tremendously, right? Obviously, India is the largest post-colonial state, right? And colonization and imperialism came from the West, right? So any sort of criticism of India on that, from that perspective is usually very kind of unwanted throughout India, right? But at the same time, it's important to underscore that when we talk about in this country shared values, we do kind of have a certain standard that we expect our fellow democratic countries to follow. Are we hypocritical? I think there are elements of that also need to be addressed. But as Secretary of State Antony Blinken said when he visited India back in 2021, this is a two-way street. We are no longer going to lecture other countries. I'm paraphrasing here. We're no longer going to lecture other countries on democracy and human rights. We will express our concerns, and our partners and our allies should also express their concerns, and it should be sort of a co-equal dialogue. So I think if the Biden administration does get involved in this issue, it will probably be along similar lines.
So Derek, I'm just wondering whether there's an appreciation for that difference of opinion in India. When Prime Minister Modi came here to the White House, and there were segments of the American press and segments of American and other Western opinion which said, oh, we must turn our attention to the question of democratic backsliding and the freedom of the press and individual rights. There were people in India who said, yes, those are legitimate concerns and those should be addressed and they should be debated and those should be talked about. This time, I think the reason why there is that unanimity of opinion in India is because what's at stake out here are questions of terrorism, questions of territorial integrity, questions of not whipping up passions in a place which is now quiet. And those are really important questions which I think need to be addressed. And that's why you're having so much unanimity in India on this particular question.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. And, as an outsider, right, I'm still trying to understand why there is such unanimity. But I do think that it kind of opens up multiple concerns that Indians have. I mean, obviously the terrorism and secessionism concern, right? But also, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is, Western countries doing things that India doesn't like, and India, now having the ability to respond in kind, unlike perhaps previously, right? Because we saw the Indians, for example, cut off visa services for Canadians worldwide, right? Things like that India may not have felt comfortable doing in the past, now they are comfortable doing, right? And so I think that there's also an element of, and I've said this publicly many times, that I believe India is an emerging great power. And there are growing pains as part of that emergence as a great power, both for India, but also for the international community, right? Because now everybody has to understand, well, what does that mean? And how do we interact with India? And how does India interact with the rest of the world? So there's kind of a lot of that is almost kind of from a microcosm type of level, right? It's all sort of built into this India-Canada dispute that we're seeing play out right now.
All right, Derek Grossman, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all those perspectives with us. It was great talking to you as always.